Hey, this is Brett, and you are watching Brett and Some Books. We are continuing the first Casualty by Philip Knightley. Chapter 3 is called The Golden Age, from 1865 to 1914. A large number of the Tommies had never been under fire before, and there was a curious look of suppressed excitement in some of the faces. Now and then I caught a man's eye in the curious gleam which comes from the joy of shedding blood, that mysterious impulse which, despite all the veneer of civilization, still holds its own in a man's nature, whether he is killing rats with a terrier, rejoicing in a prize fight, playing a salmon, or potting dervishes. It was a fine day, and we were out to kill something. Call it what you like, the experience is a big factor in the joy of living. Ernest Bennett in the Westminster Gazette, 1898. The period between the American Civil War and the First World War was The period between the American Civil War and the First World War was a golden age for the war correspondent because of the rise of the popular press, the increasing use of the telegraph, and the tardy introduction of organized censorship. The newspaper expansion in the two major newspaper reading countries was explosive. In Britain, due mainly to the Education Acts of 1870, which had made it compulsory for every child to be taught to read, the number of newspapers doubled between 1880 and 1900. During the Franco-Prussian War, the Daily News trebled its circulation. In the United States, growing circulations meant that an increasingly affluent press could afford to use the telegraph to report distant events in spite of the enormous cost. To send a report from Europe to the United States cost $5 a word. Despite what had happened in the Crimea, the military establishment was slow to realize the power of this newly awakened section of public opinion and allowed correspondents to write virtually what they liked. So for the first time, it was both physically and financially possible for a newspaper to carry its own correspondence report of a battle within days instead of weeks or months of its conclusion. Also, it was clear to the editors and proprietors of the popular press that the public demand for these reports was immense, providing they were written mainly as narratives of adventure, without too much political comment or moralizing to interrupt the narrative. It's significant that two of the big-name correspondents of this period, the London Daily News representative Archibald Forbes and Stephen Crane of the New York Journal, got their jobs because their editors had been impressed by their fictional descriptions of battles. There was the added attraction that the outcome of most wars in this period did not directly concern the future of these two countries, where the major newspaper reading public resided, Britain and the United States. Thrilling accounts of battles, slaughter, and bravery could be reported from both sides with no danger of readers identifying himself with anyone except the intrepid war correspondent, who, as a result, rapidly became the hero of his own story. The byline "from our own correspondent" vanished from the popular press, and personal names took its place. An elite corps of journalists was born, prepared to endure the punishing demands of war reporting for the delight of its rewards. Russell was still the father of the profession, but his reputation was already fading under the challenge of changed conditions and the thrusting tactics of a younger, more ambitious breed. His dispatches were still eloquent and comprehensive, but they were no longer always the first. He had difficulty keeping up with the troops and was scooped so often that he complained of a conspiracy of younger men to outdo him and the times. He had to be reminded that things had changed since the Crimea. "I beg you," he wrote his foreign editor, "to use the telegraph freely, and I and eventually he suffered the humiliation of being instructed to try to employ for the Times his arch rival Forbes. Archibald Forbes. Forbes and his colleagues were tough and resourceful. No major events involving violence had occurred anywhere in the world, however remote, during this period without at least one of them being there to report it. They traveled by horse, donkey, camel, sled, steamer, and train. They carried letters of credit, gold pieces, laissez-passer, and often a brace of pistols. There was one, an Associated Press correspondent called Mark Kellogg, with Custer at the Little Bighorn. There were dozens in the Franco-Prussian War. They were inside Paris during the siege and during the Commune. They reported the Turkish massacre of Bulgarians. One, Frank Lepore Power of the Times, was with Gordon in Khartoum. 5 died in the Turco-Serbian War, 5 in the Sudan. One, Richard Harding Davis of the New York Journal and Harper's New Monthly Magazine, of the Boxer Rebellion, and were themselves crushed by censorship in the Russo-Japanese War. The British, especially the Times correspondents, were not averse to a little intelligence work from the Foreign Office on the side, and one of the Americans, H.M. Stanley, was not above starting his own small wars in Africa and then reporting them. They were the bane of the military authorities. These newly invented curses to armies, who were not very impressed with the class of a person attracted to the job. I have seldom met a rougher or more disreputable set. Whiskey and claret ran like leitmotiv through their lives, so they tended to go to bed with their boots and spurs still on, and they had little time for the social graces. Many had been sent on a military life, and when, for various reasons, this proved impossible, they took up reporting wars as the next best career. Whatever their background, their main motivation was the thirst for battle and adventure, or as Ernest Vizitelli, who covered the Franco-Prussian War at the age of 17, wrote, a search for real romance in the midst of the work-a-day 19th century. No one denied their physical bravery, and no one suggested that they were non-combatants. A dervish bullet, almost spent, hit Bennett Burleigh of the Daily Telegraph in the neck. Pick it out, he told Melton Pryor, the illustrated London news artist, and went on firing. James Creelman of the New York Journal led a bayonet charge in Cuba during the Spanish-American War. Forbes rode through Zulu lines to reach a telegraph office with news of the Battle of Ulundi, but it is hard to escape the impression that they were all slightly mad. H. Munro, the author Saki of the Westminster Gazette's correspondent in the Balkans, kept cool by playing a siphon of soda water on his shoulder blades. Frederick Villiers went to war with a bicycle. Burleigh showed up at official receptions dressed in a seedy frock coat and posing as an American senator. Maurice Baring sent to the Morning Post dispatches on the Russo-Japanese War so lengthy and so scholarly that the editor recalled him to London and appointed him as a drama critic. Luigi Barzini was so terrified of being accused of being corrupt that he would accept no foreign decorations, and Edmund O'Donovan of the London Daily News danced drunk and naked around what the Muslims believed to be Eames' tomb, shouting, "To the devil with the Mahdi!" They were, everyone agrees, a colorful crew, but they did not measure up to their job. They showed little humanity and no historical perspective. With one or two exceptions, they pandered to the bloodthirsty tastes of the age, chronicling the deaths of thousands of men with little concern beyond whether the event they were witnessing would make a good report. I've been able to find only one, Monsieur de Conway, in the New York World, who was so sickened by what he saw that he gave up being a war correspondent altogether. The rest devoted themselves to the battle of getting news back to their newspapers before their rivals did. The author has known an Arab servant to be followed for yards and beaten most cruelly with a heavy... I have known an Arab servant to be followed for yards and beaten most cruelly with a heavy stick, wrote Ernest Bennett, because owing to a breakdown of the telegraph, he was unable to forward a message by his master. And war, for most of them, was a highly profitable game, and they became thrill purveyors, serving, as the author-correspondent Vincent Sheehan put it, as professional observers at the peep show of misery. Since the misery they were observing was usually that of natives or foreigners, it did not really matter, as witness Ernest Bennett's reference to the beginning of this chapter to potting dervishes, or in this report by Winwood Reade of the Times, I went out after breakfast and found an Ashanti skirmisher. I stalked the man until I got near enough to see him. I missed him twice. The third time I silenced his fire, and I think I silenced him. At all events, I afterwards found a body lying close to the spot. Only 2 or 3, like the Americans Januarius McGann and James Creelman and the Italian Luigi Barzini, felt sufficiently concerned over what they witnessed to write in protest against the conduct of war, to be partisans for truth and compassion rather than adventure and glory. Even fewer had the, quote, hearing ear and seeing eye, end quote, that enabled them to discern the deeper implications of the chance events they witnessed. In general, the war correspondent during the Golden Age regarded war much as Bennett has described it, quote, a big factor in the joy of living, end quote. Their needs were accurately assessed by General Sir Hector MacDonald, who greeted their arrival as his troops got ready to receive a dervish charge, with these words, "Gentlemen, I am delighted to welcome you. I think I can give you good sport." It was the Franco-Prussian War that marked the decline of William Russell and the rise of Archibald Forbes, the leader of the New Guard. Forbes, moved by a lecture given by Russell, had enlisted in the Royal Dragoons, where he had learned something of military matters. After 5 years, his health had broken down, and he left the service to start a newspaper called the London Scotsman. He also wrote a novel about the Indian Mutiny. The battle scenes in this, based on the recollections of a veteran, attracted the attention of the Morning Advertiser, which offered him a commission to cover the Franco-Prussian War on a, quote, pay if used, end quote, basis, with a £10 for outfitting and £20 for expenses. Forbes, who spoke German, was convinced that the Germans would win, and so, against most advice, he chose the German side. This turned out to be a wise move. France had made no plans for war, and its highest command was corrupt and inefficient. At the Battle of Sedan, the army of Chalon had 3 commanders-in-chief in almost as many hours, and various officers were not above telegraphing news of non-existent vagaries to rig the stock markets. It's understandable, therefore, that France decided she would allow no war correspondents to operate at all. On the other hand, the German Chancellor, Bismarck, realized the propaganda value of a friendly press. Nothing will be more favorable to our political standings in England and America than the appearance in the 2 most influential papers of those countries of very detailed accounts of our army in the field. In England and in America there was a great deal of interest in the war. Although both countries were determinedly neutral, Britain was so much so that at first the government ruled that if there were to be no reporting of the French side, because of the French government's attitude, then the only neutral thing would be to allow any British war correspondents to cover the German side. A spirited protest by the Times editor, Delane, helped to reverse this decision, and Forbes and his colleagues set out for the front. The first decisive engagement of the war, a battle at Gravelotte-Saint-Paris in August 1870, saw the French put to flight, but also saw two major events in the history of war reporting. Forbes, who was soon to dominate the profession, wrote his first major war report and realized his own ability. Bismarck and the King of Prussia are awaiting the battle's outcome. Forbes is observing them. The old king sat with his back against a wall on a ladder, one end of which rested upon a broken gun carriage, the other on a dead horse. Bismarck, with an elaborate assumption of coolness which his restlessness belied, made pretense to be reading letters. The roll of the close battle swelled and deepened till the very ground trembled beneath us. The hoofs of a galloping horse rattled on the causeway. A moment later, Moltke, his face for once quivering with emotion, sprang from his saddle and, running to the king, cried out, "It is good for us. We have carried the position, and the victory is with your majesty." The king started to his feet with a fervent, "God be thanked," and then burst into tears. Bismarck, with a great sigh of relief, crushed his letters in the hollow of his hand. The second major event, a landmark, was the organized use of the telegraph, arranged by the seasoned American Civil War reporter George W. Smalley of the New York Tribune. Smalley first set up a pool arrangement between the Tribune and the London Daily News. Each would have a right to use the dispatches of the other's correspondence. Then he carefully briefed each correspondent on what was required of him. My instructions were very simple, but I believe at that time were novel in England. Each was to find his way to the front, or wherever a battle was most likely fought. If he had the good luck to witness an important battle, he was not to telegraph, but, unless for some very peremptory reason, he was to start at once for London, writing accounts by the way or after his arrival. If he could telegraph a summary first, so much the better. But there must be no delay. The essential thing was to arrive in London at the earliest moment. Only when in London was a correspondent master of the situation. The plan worked well. The Battle of Gravelotte was described by one of the Tribune team in a telegraph costing $5,000, and his report appeared in the United States only 2 days after the event. The first attempt in the Old World to describe battle over the telegraph wires. A full account of the battle reached London, almost as if Smalley had arranged it, and when Monsieur de Conway of the New York Herald walked into the Daily News office and said he had telegraphed his own paper an outline of the battle, but wanted to describe what he had witnessed during his train journey back through France. He had traveled on the roof of a hospital train and had seen the ghastly plight of the wounded. "At times I was sick and faint. The earth yawned into one vast grave. The blue sky was a pall. The sun had turned to blood." Smalley snapped up Conway's account, and it was telegraphed all over Europe. Conway could have gone on to a brilliant future, but for weeks his dreams were plagued by what he had seen. He decided he was not cut out to be a war correspondent and abandoned that career. The war continued badly for the French. At the Battle of Sedan, they were surrounded and forced to surrender, and Napoleon III was taken prisoner. Paris was soon under siege. Forbes had done extremely well. He and a Dutch correspondent had been the only civilians to witness Napoleon surrendering himself to Bismarck at an isolated weaver's cottage. But the Morning Advertiser had a correspondent in Paris who would cover the siege, so Forbes was ordered to return to London. There he offered his services to the Daily News, was engaged at the then princely sum of £20 a week, and began a paid partnership with the paper that was to make them both famous. Meanwhile, William Russell was having a difficult time. The Times had sent him to accompany the Germans and he was received by them as an honored guest. But he soon found that his dispatches were arriving in Britain days after the Daily News had printed the highlights of the battle. The problem for Russell was not simply how to reorganize his communication system, but to reorganize it, recognizing that he needed a new approach to his writing. While correspondents were still sending their dispatches by mail or by courier, they could afford a leisurely literary approach to their stories. Sending a summary of a battle by telegraph meant adopting a new style, crisp, concise, and packed with facts. The beginning of the who, how, where, when, why dictum that remains basically unchanged in popular news reporting today. Russell firmly set in his ways, and some 20 years later, 20 years older than Forbes and his colleagues, could not cope. No paper has been so badly served as the Times during this great war by all its correspondents, old and new, wrote the Times manager, and in a letter, excuse me, baby, you have very nice paws, but that's not what's happening right now. And in a letter to Russell begging him to use the telegraph freely, he added, the Daily News has beaten us hollow and continues to do so. Forbes' success was largely due to careful planning, free use of money, and his native ingenuity. He went to great trouble to work out a communications route before setting out for the battlefield. When Paris was under siege, he had an arrangement whereby he could post a letter at any German military post office in the environs of the city. It was collected by the field post wagon, placed on the post train to Saarbrücken, and there delivered to the station telegraph master, who transmitted it to London. So efficient was the German postal system that, and so carefully briefed was the telegraph master that no matter at what point around Paris Forbes found himself, a dispatch sent in this manner reached London within 24 hours, a feat difficult to equal at the time of writing this book in 75. Given a latitude, even more remarkable scoops were possible. Forbes acquired in advance details of the projected German bombardment in the Paris quarter of St. Denis. These he sent to London, where they were set in type by Daily News and held in readiness. At the first gun was fired, Forbes, standing in the doorway of his telegraph office at German headquarters, bellowed to the operator the two words, "Go ahead!" And on receipt of this message in London, the prepared account was rushed to press, where it made the noon edition that same day, easily beating all rival newspapers. While Forbes was taxing his ingenuity with the besieging Prussian forces, an even more colorful figure, Henry Labouche, an English newspaper owner, was delighting Daily News readers with his provocative and entertaining accounts of life within the besieged city. Labouche was witty and a talented son of a banker, had been something of a dilettante. As an undergraduate in Cambridge, he had run up gambling debts of £6,000, and his career in the diplomatic service had been cut short by his refusal to accept a posting as second secretary to the British Embassy at Buenos Aires, unless he was allowed to operate from Baden-Baden. He had been a shareholder in the Daily News, and and when the siege caught him in Paris, he persuaded the resident correspondent, a married man with children, to take the last train out of the city. Labouche then began sending, by balloon, a series of dispatches, which the news published under the byline "Besieged Resident," so as to protect Labouche from reprisals by the French. Labouche scorned the bravado expected of war correspondents. I confess I am not one of those persons who snuffs up the battle from afar and feels an irresistible desire to rush into the middle of it. To be knocked on the head by a shell merely to gratify one's curiosity appears to me to be the utmost height of absurdity. So Labouche ignored the daily shelling, by which some 10 or 12 people were killed, and concentrated on chronicling Parisians' determination to survive as food supplies rapidly ran out, and they began to eat animals from the zoo, and then to cook substances no one before had considered as food. Daily news circulation soared steadily, despite its readers' horror at what Labouche had sampled for his latest dinner. Cat. He found something between rabbit and squirrel with a flavor all of its own. It is delicious. Kittens, either smothered in onions or in a ragout, are excellent. Donkey was like mutton, and a salami of rats tasted something between frog and rabbit. Being an Englishman, eating dog worried him. I have a guilty feeling when I eat dog, the friend of man. I had a slice of spaniel the other day. It was by no means bad, something like lamb, but I felt like a cannibal. Paris surrendered at the end of January 1871, and in the early hours of the armistice, Labouche was astonished to meet Archibald Forbes. Forbes was very welcome, since he had thought to bring with him 7 pounds of ham, although Labouche was not certain he would be able to get used to the strange taste. Forbes had got into Paris during the preliminary armistice by a typical mixture of initiative and luck. 50 correspondents were waiting on the Versailles side to enter the city. None of them succeeded. Forbes got in on the north and rode with deliberate blindness past the gendarmes examining papers. He stayed for 18 hours, gathering material for a long dispatch, with which, once again, the Daily News scooped the world press. The Germans entered Paris on March 1st. The Times, determined to regain some of the reputation it had lost to the Daily News, engaged a special train for Russell to travel in as far as Calais, and then chartered a steamer to Dover, and then another special train to London. In spite of these expensive arrangements, Russell's descriptive story was out only an hour ahead of that of Forbes, who had used the ordinary means of transport. Russell finally realized that his career was in decline. He was persuaded to accompany Sir Garnet Wolseley to South Africa in 1879, but an accident with his horse made him lame, and he never covered another war. He came to believe, by the time of his death in 1907, that the war correspondent's best days were over, and that increasing military censorship had killed the craft he had helped pioneer. Forbes went on to more success, covering the Paris Commune and its brutal end. The stark cruelties of the class war that broke out in March impelled him, against his normal sympathies, to take the side of the underdog. His dispatches sent back to England with his usual ingenuity. One he carried himself, dressed as a diplomatic courier and clutching a big envelope addressed to Her Majesty the Queen of England, attracted considerable attention. During the bloody week of May 21st to May 28th, he reported the troops at Versailles enjoying the fine game of communist hunting. The Parisians of civil life are captives to the last drop of their thin, sour white blood, but yesterday they had cried, Vive la Commune! Today they rubbed their hands with livid, currish joy to have it in their power to denounce a communist and reveal his hiding place. Very eager at this work are the dear creatures of women. They have found him, the miserable, a tall, pale, hatless man with something not ignoble in his carriage. His lower lip is trembling, but his brow is firm, and the eye of him has some pride and defiance in it. They yell, the crowd, Shoot him! Shoot him! An arm goes into the air, and there is a stick in the fist. The stick falls on the head of the man in black. Ha! The infection is caught. Men club their rifles and bring them down on the head, or clash them into splinters on their lust for murder. Certain British impulse, a stronger than consideration for self, prompts me to run forward, but it is useless. They are firing into the flaccid carcass now, thronging about it like blowflies on a piece of meat. His brains spurt on my foot and splash into the gutter, and whither the carrion is bloody chucked, presently to be trodden on and rolled on by the feet of multitudes and wheels of gun carriages. The Eastern question became the next crisis. The Prime Minister, Disraeli, sympathized with Turkey, for the Russians who threatened her had persecuted Jews. Gladstone, on the other hand, supported the rebellious Balkan peoples. At this point, it fell to a war correspondent to write what still stands as one of the major exposure stories of history, one that became directly responsible for a war and eventually led to the independence of Bulgaria. The correspondent concerned was Januarius Aloysius McGahan, an American of Irish extraction who had a passionate hatred of justice and oppression. He was already a journalist of distinction who had astonished the newspaper world by a remarkable ride across the Central Asian steppe in order to catch up with a Russian military expedition on its way to Turkestan. On this way, he sailed on the bark Pandora in search of the Northwest Passage and had written several successful books about both expeditions. In 1876, reports began to reach Constantinople of terrible atrocities by Turkish forces in southern Bulgaria against the Christian population. The London Daily News commissioned McGahan to the southern Bulgaria and try to find out the truth. Between July 28th and August 16th, a series of his letters was published in the Daily News, afterwards being reprinted in the Worldwide and later republished as a booklet. The Times was furious because it had to wait several days for its own correspondent to confirm McGahan's story, a humiliating delay that forced its management to admit, "These Yankees are undoubtedly pushing fellows with a great gift for routing out facts." It is difficult to overestimate the influence of McGahan's report, the accuracy of which was confirmed by investigation years later, when passions had cooled. Over 12,000 men, women, and children had been killed by the Kurds, and Bashi bazooks let loose by the Turkish rulers to crush the Bulgarian revolt. McGahan interviewed hundreds of survivors and clearly was deeply moved by what he saw and heard. "I think I came in a fair and impartial frame of mind. I fear I am no longer impartial, and I am certainly no longer cool. There are things too horrible to allow anything like calm inquiry, things the vileness of which the eye refuses to look upon, and which the mind refuses to contemplate. We came to an object that filled us with pity and horror. It was the skeleton of a young girl not more than 15. It was still clothed in a chemise. The ankles were enclosed in footless stockings, but the little feet, from which the shoes had been taken, were naked, and owing to the fact that the flesh had dried instead of decomposing, were nearly perfect. The procedure seems to have been as follows. They would seize a woman, strip her carefully to her chemise, laying aside any ornaments and jewels she might have about her. Then, as many of them cared, would violate her, and the last man would kill her, or not, as the humor took him. We were told there were 3,000 people lying in this little churchyard alone. It was a fearful sight, a sight to haunt one through life. There were little curly heads there, in that festering mass, crushed down by heavy stones, little feet not as long as your finger on which the flesh was dried hard, little baby hands stretched out as if for help, babies that had died wondering at the first bright gleam of sabers and the red hands of the fierce-eyed men who wielded them, children who had died shrieking with fright and terror, mothers who died trying to shield their little ones with their own weak bodies, all lying there together, festering in one horrid mass. Magayan's stories caused worldwide indignation against the Turks. Russia decided that his disclosures justified a war, and on April 29, 1877, began hostilities against Turkey. 8 correspondents turned up to cover the Russian side. The Russians gave them a virtual carte blanche. There was to be no field censorship, and correspondents were put on their honor to not reveal details of impending maneuvers. Despite this auspicious start, by the end of the war, which had lasted barely a year, only 4 of the original correspondents were still in action. Sickness, wounds, and exhaustion had eliminated the rest. Magayan, Forbes, and the correspondent artist Villiers were among the survivors. The depth of Magayan's personal commitment to the cause he was reporting can be gauged by the fact that he went to war with 1 foot in a plaster cast, a result of an injury from a fall. He ignored this disability completely, and even after 2 further accidents had crippled him seriously, he carried on, watching the fighting from a gun carriage. The strain of the campaign took its toll, and a few months after he reached Constantinople, following the Turkish surrender, Magayan fell ill with typhus. Within a week he was dead. He was buried in a little Greek cemetery at Pera, his funeral being attended by generals and correspondents alike, and in St. Petersburg, masses were said for his soul. 5 years later, his body was brought by an American warship to New York, where it lay in state in City Hall before being buried in the Ohio village where Magayan was born. The Bulgarians, who considered he had played a crucial role in the birth of their state, commemorated his death for years afterward with an annual Requiem Mass at Ternova. Forbes, too, emerged from the Russo-Turkish War with distinction. It was he, in August 1877, who carried the first news of the Russian victory at Shipka not only to the world, but to the Tsar himself. The Tsar was so pleased that he decorated Forbes with the Order of St. Stanislaus, with the crossed swords, awarded only for personal bravery, and ordered a carriage to help him get the story out. Forbes crossed the Danube at Rutschik, and then rode on to Bucharest, where he arrived at 8 p.m. He had 3 days and nights, either in the saddle or under fire in the trenches at Shipka, without sleep, often without food. I was dead tired. Not a word of my dispatch was written, and I had news for which I knew the world was waiting, news on which the fate of an empire and the fortunes of half of Europe depended. And, as much as I could do, I kept my eyes open, or sit up in the chair into which I had dropped. I told the waiter to bring me a pint of dry champagne, unopened. Then I took the cork out, put the neck of the bottle in my mouth, and drank it with all the fizz, sat up, and wrote the 4 columns you read the next morning in the Daily News. Ford's next major campaign was the Zulu War of 1879. At the Battle of Ulundi, he watched from inside a British square as thousands of Zulu warriors pitted their spears against artillery and rifle fire. When the news of the victory when the Zulus eventually fled, Forbes learned that no messenger was to be sent with the news of the victory until the following morning. He left immediately, taking his own dispatch and a sketch hurriedly prepared by Melton Pryor of... God, come on, baby. Of the Illustrated London News, and rode through 10 miles of Zulu country, swarming with remnants of the defeated Zulu army. Using the British forts situated at 15-mile intervals as staging posts, he made Landsman's Drift, 120 miles from Ulundi, in 20 hours. Here he telegraphed his dispatch, which was read in both houses of Parliament. A proud moment, the Times said, for the confraternity of special correspondents. But despite the fame that these achievements brought him, and although he lived for another 20 years, Forbes did little more active reporting, and after the Zulu campaign, he went into virtual retirement. A clue to his motives for this decision lies in his description of the scene at Insendwala, where British column had been wiped out. The newcomer to such a scene of horror might blunder inarticulately in passionate identification and emotional involvement. Forbes does not. He orders his material cold-bloodedly, moving at a steady pace to the climax of transfixed skull, and then cushioning the reader with a touch of homely sentiment and a perfectly judged anticlimax. 1,000 corpses had been laying there in rain, and for 4 long months the dead lay as they had fallen, for the vultures of Zululand, that will reduce a dead ox to a skeleton in a few hours, had apparently never touched the corpses of our ill-fated countrymen. All the way up the slope I traced, by ghastly token of dead men with fitful line of flight. It was a long string with knots in it, a string formed of single corpses, the groups, the knots of little clusters of dead, where, as it seems, little groups must have gathered to make a hopeless, gallant stand, and so die. Still following the trail of dead bodies through rank grass and among stones, I approached the crest. Here the slaughtered dead lay very thick, so that the string became a broad belt. A strange dead calm reigned on this solitude of nature. Grain had grown luxuriantly under the wagons, sprouting from the seed that had dropped from the loads, falling on soil fertilized by the lifeblood of gallant men. As one strayed aimlessly about, one fumbled in the grass over skeletons that rattled to the touch. Here lay a corpse with a bayonet jammed into the mouth up to the socket, transfixing the head and mouth a foot into the ground. There lay a form that seemed cozily curled in calm sleep, turned almost on its face, but 7 assegai stabs had pierced the back. It was miserablest work wandering about the desolate camp amid the sour odor of stale death and gathering sad relics, letters from home, photographs, and blood-stained books. A clever piece of reporting, yet it has the cold touch of a professional who has been too long familiar with scenes that would arouse most men a lifetime's horror. Did Forbes realize this? Whether he did so or not, it was the last war piece he wrote. He died in London in 1900, raving in his final delirium about the battlefield. "Those guns, man! Those guns! Don't you hear those guns?" It was in Africa that the British Army made a stand against the incursions war correspondents had been making into a field it regarded as its own. Senior officers felt that by the actions of men like Forbes, they were being robbed of the glory of reporting their victories. So Sir Herbert, later Lord Kitchener, Sirdar of the Egyptian army, advancing against the dervishes in the Sudan to avenge the death of General Gordon, did his utmost to hamper correspondence in every way he could. He particularly disliked Winston Churchill, who had pulled every string available to him to see action in the Sudan and thus advance his army career. Churchill eventually managed to get there by persuading the War Office to allow him to go out as a supernumerary lieutenant at his own expense. Kitchener was much annoyed, and it is hard to believe that, as Churchill tells it, when Kitchener learned that Churchill proposed to finance his campaign by writing for the Morning Post, quote, he simply shrugged his shoulders and passed on to what were all matters of greater concerns, end quote. Kitchener's tactics were to make the 26 correspondents with him run exactly the same risks as his soldiers, to limit their telegraphic facilities to 200 words a day, and to give them no help, no briefings, no guidance, and little courtesy. It was not surprising that they hated him, and his disdain for them was what happened over war news at the outbreak of the First World War. The correspondent who attracted the most attention during this campaign was George Warrington Stevens of the Daily Mail, whose career was to be cut short by his death of enteric fever at Ladysmith in 1900. Stevens, a Balliol man, joined the Daily Mail after a brilliant career at Oxford, where he took a first in classics and introduced into the urgent world of war writing an elegance of style and a much admired standard of accuracy. I vowed to state nothing on authority unless I saw it myself or heard it from a European who had seen it. Stevens appears to have felt more than most the difficulty of reconciling the glories of battles with its horrors, and although he wrote the usual jingoistic cliches, he at least made an effort to point out the gruesome side of war as well. Here he describes Kitchener's advance at Atbara to cut the Dervish army to pieces. It was not so difficult to go on. The pipes picked you up and carried you on, but it was difficult not to hurry. Yet, whether they aimed or advanced, they did it orderly. Raw youngsters, gravely, without speaking, the bullets had whispered to raw youngsters in one breath the secret of all the glorious of the British Army. 3 men went down with a cry at the very foot of the Union Jack, and only one got to his feet again. The flag shook itself and still blazed splendidly. Beyond is a low stockade. But what of that? Over and in. Hurrah, hurrah, hurrah! Now fallen and back to the desert outside, and unless you are congenitally amorous of whores, don't look too much about you. Black spindle-legged curled up to meet red gimleted faces, black faces, donkeys headless and legless, or sieves of shrapnel, camels with necks writhed back on their humps, rotting already in pools of blood and bile, yellow heads without faces, and faces without anything below, cobwebbed arms and legs, black skins grilled to crackling on smoldering palm leaf. Don't look at it. Here is the Sirdar of white star and crescent unread. Here is the Sirdar who created this battle, this clean-jointed, well-oiled, smooth-running, clockwork-perfect masterpiece of a battle. Not a flaw, not a check, not a jolt, not a fleck on its shining success. Once more, hurrah, hurrah, hurrah. The development in war reporting in Europe and Africa had by now left America somewhat behind, and so the outbreak of the Spanish-American War in 1898 was seized upon by the newspapers in the United States, particularly the so-called yellow press, as a chance to catch up. American correspondents such as flamboyant Richard Harding Davis had been reporting the Cuban insurgent struggles for the independence from Spain for almost 2 years. Davis and his newspaper's proprietor, William Randolph Hearst, believed that the United States should intervene to help the rebels, and they did their best to inflame public opinion with articles like Davis's famous The Death of Rodriguez. Rodriguez, a rebel captured in the skirmish, was publicly executed by firing squad. Davis watched and then filed a long description of the event, ending with, "As I look back, the figure of the young Cuban, who was no longer a part of the world of Santa Clara, was asleep in the wet grass, with his motionless arms still tightly bound behind him, with a scapular twisted awry across his face, the blood from his breast sinking into the soil he had tried to free." Hearst was delighted with the success of Davis's story. His paper, the New York Journal, was in the middle of a battle with Joseph Pulitzer's World, and war was good circulation-building material. If, of course, America could be involved in the war, then circulation prospects would be even better. Hearst did all he could to bring this about. He sent Carl Decker to rescue Evangelina Cisneros, daughter of a Cuban insurgent leader, from jail. He sent an artist, Frederick Remington, to convey visually what Davis had done with words. Remington was not keen on the assignment and found things quiet when he arrived. There is a story about an exchange of telegrams that followed which, even if it's apocryphal, illustrates Hearst's determination to get America into the war. Remington telegraphed to Hearst, "Everything is quiet. There is no trouble here. There will be no war. I wish to return." Hearst replied, "Please remain. You furnish pictures. I will furnish war." When the American battleship Maine blew up in the Havana harbor, the Spaniards insisted it was an accident and suggested a court of inquiry. Hearst, without a particle of proof, attributed it to, quote, "an enemy's secret infernal machine," end quote, and in the wave of patriotic fervor that swept the United States, he was finally able to furnish his correspondence with the war. From a correspondent's point of view, it was an ideal campaign. 200 turned up to cover it, including 25 from Hearst's group alone. Expenses were no object. Cable charges for a single story ran to $8,000. The Associated Press chartered a flotilla of boats, which throughout their naval engagements cruised at will through the battle lines, ignoring fire from both sides and scurrying back and forth to the nearest cable station. The circulations of Hearst newspapers climbed dizzily as his success forced other owners to compete. Larger and larger headline type was used to attract readers' attention, until letters 4 inches high, often in red, occupied almost all of the front page space. Correspondence copy had to match the headlines, and some took to such gross exaggeration that a New York Herald man insisted that there was, quote, "a factory out there for faking war news," end quote. One way of drawing readers was by employing as war correspondent someone with a famous name, which was how Stephen Crane, author of the widely read Civil War book The Red Badge of Courage, entered the business. Crane had written the battle scenes in his book out of his imagination and had never seen action, but this had not deterred Hearst from employing him as a correspondent for the journal. After failing to get through to the Cuban rebels, Crane had gone to Greece to write about the Greco-Turkish campaign. There, he had not been very popular with his colleagues, who resented his engagement as a war correspondent on his reputation as a novelist. One reported, "Crane came up and wrote a 1,300-word story. He was never near the front, but I don't say I said so." They particularly disliked his digs at the conventional descriptions of battle, like this one. "The roll of musketry was tremendous. It was more impressive than the roar of Niagara and finer than thunder or avalanche. It was the most beautiful sound in my experience, barring no symphony. This is one point of view. Another might be taken from the men who died there." Crane switched to the New York World for the Spanish-American War and covered the famous charge up San Juan Hill by the Rough Riders, volunteers who had learnt their horsemanship playing polo, and who were led by the remarkable Theodore Roosevelt, noted for his jingoistic view of life. "We must play a great part in this world, and especially perform those deeds of blood and valor which, above everything, bring national renown." But after the American naval victory at Santiago, the closing stages of the war slipped into comedy, and finally only 9 correspondents remained. When the Americans invaded Puerto Rico, the inhabitants welcomed them with bottles and bouquets, which encouraged Crane to try to capture a town himself. Richard Harding Davis was to accompany him, but Crane double-crossed him and did not awaken him at the arranged time and went alone. Crane got his scoop, but it is Davis's delightful description of what happened that is remembered. "While I slumbered, Crane crept forward between our advanced posts and fell on the doomed garrison. He approached Juana Diaz in a hollow square, smoking a cigarette. His khaki suit, slouched hat, and leggings were all that was needed to drive the first man he saw, or rather the man who saw him, back up the town in disorderly retreat. The man aroused the village, and 10 minutes later the alcalde surrendered to him and the keys of the cartel. Crane told me that no general in that moment of victory had ever acted in a more generous manner. He shot no one against the wall, looted no churches, levied no forced loans. Instead, he lined up the male members of the community in the plaza and organized a joint celebration of conquerors and conquered. He separated the men into 2 classes, roughly divided between good fellows and suspects. Anyone whose appearance Crane did not approve, anyone whose necktie did not even suit his fancy, was listed as a suspect. The good fellows he graciously permitted to act as his host and bodyguard. The others he ordered to their homes. From the barred windows they looked out with envy on the feast of brotherly love that overflowed from the plaza into the by-streets and lashed itself into a frenzied carnival of rejoicing. It was a long night, and it will be long remembered in Juana Diaz. The following morning, a colonel and 800 American troops crept cautiously up to take Juana Diaz by surprise. The colonel's astonishment at the sight of Crane was sincere. His pleasure was no less great. He knew that it did not fall to the lot of every colonel to have his victories immortalized by the genius who had written the Red Badge of Courage. "I'm glad to see you," he cried eagerly. "Have you been marching with my men?" Crane shook his head. "I am sorry," said the colonel. "I should like you to have seen us take this town." "This town?" said Crane in polite embarrassment. "I'm really very sorry, Colonel, but I took this town myself before breakfast yesterday morning." The other correspondents best remembered from the Spanish-American War James Creelman, who not only wrote news but often made it as well. Creelman, a Canadian by birth, had reported the Japanese invasion of Manchuria and the capture of Port Arthur, perhaps his most famous piece. It's a textbook example of vivid, concise reporting, forced on Creelman by communication difficulties. He was later able to elaborate his short cable, but the first account, on December 11th, 1894, stands on its own. The Japanese troop entered Port Arthur on November 21st and massacred practically the entire population in cold blood. The defenseless and unarmed inhabitants were butchered in their houses, and their bodies were unspeakably mutilated. There was an unrestrained reign of murder which continued for 3 days. The whole town was plundered with appalling atrocities. It was the first stain upon the Japanese civilization. The Japanese, in this instant, relapsed into barbarism. All pretense that circumstances justified the atrocities are false. The civilized world will be horrified by the details. The foreign correspondents, horrified by the spectacle, left the army in a body. The Japanese had offered Creelman a bribe to tone down his story, but he refused it. American public opinion, until then friendly to Japan, changed overnight. With this reputation, Creelman was in heavy demand to go to Cuba, and he eventually agreed to do so for Hearst's Journal. He was with General Adna Chaffee in an attack on the Spanish blockhouse at El Caney, on the outskirts of Santiago. Pinned down under heavy fire, Creelman seems to have forgotten that he was a correspondent and offered to lead a bayonet charge on the blockhouse. The charge was a success, and Creelman had a front-page story. But before he could begin to write it, a bullet smashed his left arm. He was found by William Randolph Hearst himself, playing war correspondent and gripped by a fever for yet another scoop. Someone knelt in the grass by me and put his hand on my fevered head. Opening my eyes, I saw Mr. Hearst, a revolver at his belt and a pencil and notebook in his hand. The man who had provoked the war had come to see the result with his own eyes, and finding one of his correspondents prostrate, was doing the work himself. Slowly, he took down my story of the fight. That battle had to be reported somehow. "I'm sorry you're hurt, but..." His face was radiant with enthusiasm. "Wasn't it a splendid fight? We must beat every paper in the world." Hearst's enthusiasm for American victories became even more marked in the American campaign to suppress the revolt in the Philippines that raged from 1899 to 1902. Wholesale and indiscriminate killing by American troops had depopulated large sections of the country. There were complaints that the troops had on one occasion been ordered to kill everything over 10 years old, and that the 20th Kansas had swept through a town of 17,000 inhabitants, leaving not one native alive, and a defense that foreshadowed the attitude of many Americans to Vietnam more than 60 years later. Hearst's New York Journal said, "The weak must go to the wall and stay there. We'll rule in Asia as we rule at home. We shall establish in Asia a branch agent of the true American movement towards liberty." While the Spanish-American War was in progress, there were rumblings in the Far East. In 1898, a Chinese secret society called the Righteous Harmony Fists, or Boxers by Europeans, had begun persecuting Christians in northeastern China. This was symptomatic of the social unrest and anti-foreign feeling that had followed China's humiliating defeat by Japan in 1895. But the European powers still proceeded with plans for the partitioning of the country. Eventually, in 1900, bands of Boxers, who believed they had divine immunity from foreign bullets, fell upon all foreigners they could find and killed them. An international force set out to suppress the uprising and punish the Boxers. It was a little covered campaign because the eyes of Britain and America were on South Africa, where a ridiculously small force of Boers was tackling the might of the British Army. But a shy, nervous Italian war correspondent, Luigi Barzini, was in China, beginning to make a reputation for himself that was to carry him through 8 wars and make him one of the best-known journalists in Europe. Barzini was a rare correspondent. He saw no glory, no heroics in war, only slaughter. He had, quote, "the hearing ear and the seeing eye," end quote, to perceive repercussions beyond the battle he was witnessing, and the courage to write what he believed. He never learned to administer his talents or to exploit his reputation. He considered it undignified to ask for more money from his newspaper, and his family lived in penury. He refused foreign decorations for fear they might be considered as payment, and the editorship of a rival paper, because it seemed to me like a desertion. In his later years, he grew bitter as men with less talent made more successful careers, but he is remembered as a fine correspondent. It was in the Far East, beginning with the Boxer Rebellion, that he flourished. He described the brutality of the suppression, foresaw that it would lead only to a more violent rejection of Western influence, denounced the poor equipment the Italian section of the international force had, and caught the tragic-comic aspects of the campaign. Italian journalism had never known such immediacy and veracity. Here he is describing the bloodlust of 100 Cossacks as they put to flight 2,000 Boxers. "We were about 300 yards from them. Their heads, swathed in red, recalled a regiment of French soldiers marching. Their red waistbands flamed in the sun. Above was a whirl of swords, a dance of lances with red tassels. All of a sudden, those in front, then others, then all, threw themselves on their knees to pray. There they began to advance. The mad courage was fantastic. What was happening before my eyes absorbed me completely. At that moment I did not consider that I was armed and that perhaps I should think of defending myself. All my life was concentrated in my eyes. The Boxers were halted by a volley from the Cossack infantrymen, but 30 of them left the main body and advanced. The last of these 30 to be killed, quote, flourished 2 sabers, one in each hand, like a juggler, end quote. A shot and he fell flat on his face, but he immediately raised himself on his knees, waving his saber. Another shot flattened him again, but he raised himself on his elbow, brandishing the weapon again, until the last shot threw him in the dust forever. At this point, all the Boxers turned and fled. Then it seemed like that hurricane had swept out from the corn stalks. The Cossacks had charged, bent over their horses, with their sabers in the air, shouting, "Ah, yeah!" They galloped like a pack of hounds behind the fox. An immense cloud of dust rose behind everything. One could barely see their white jackets swaying as they galloped. A great cry arose, and they had reached the Boxers. One Boxer fled, holding his lance horizontally on his head with his arms raised. A Cossack followed close on his heels. From the road, the Chinese had crossed a field and were about to enter the corn stalks when the scimitar, which was raised above him, fell. The lance was broken like a twig, and the saber blade entered the Chinaman's head. The blows which landed on heads made horrible sounds. One Boxer, an old man with a gray beard, killed in the middle of the road, had his head literally split in 2. After some minutes, the ground was covered with the dead, plastered with dust, which, over their wounds, became bloody mud. Meanwhile, the hunters had gone further away. Their shouts could barely be heard every so often. A trumpet sounded in a vain attempt to make them return. Every now and then, a Cossack emerged from the road and crossed it at a gallop. The officers would shout at him to stop, but he would continue his pursuit. It was like trying to recall hounds chasing stags. Captain Menafkin returned alone, trotting through the dead, smiling, slapping his saber. He shouted to me, "I killed 2, only 2, but what do you expect? That rabble ran like a pack of hares. What did you do?" "Nothing. Now I've taken some photographs for my paper." "Good, but tell the truth. You enjoyed yourself, didn't you?" Barzini returned to the Far East for the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, the first modern war in which a Western nation was beaten by an Asian power. Correspondents of the Japanese imposed stifling censorship that kept the band of international correspondents cooling their heels in Tokyo's best hotels. Few of them saw anything of the decisive battles. Jack London, the novelist representing the Hearst group, lost his patience, struck a Japanese, and was rescued only by the intervention of Richard Harding Davis. The others were loud in their complaints. Frederick Palmer of Collier's complained that the Japanese censor would only allow him to write what was "everything is going to plan." John Fox reported in Scribner's magazine, "In simple kindness, the Japs might have said, 'Over here we do not recognize the ancient Occidental God-given right of newspapers to divulge the private purposes of anybody.'" The Japanese were easier on their own correspondents. Asahi, Mainichi, and Jiji all had men at the front, and Mainichi reporter was an eyewitness account of the Battle of Nanshan after accompanying the Japanese 11th Division into action as a munitions carrier. The attitude of the Japanese to foreign correspondents can be partly explained by their feeling that some of the correspondents were spies. This was understandable in view of the activities of some of the journalists with whom the Japanese had previously come in contact, especially those representing the Times of London. The Times had not considered it unwise to allow some of its correspondents to also work for various government departments. Thus, we find Frank Lepore, when he was with Gordon in Khartoum, acting as a British consul and sending daily telegraphs to the British agent in Egypt for forwarding to the Foreign Office. George Ernest, Chinese, Morrison, the Australian who became Far Eastern correspondent of the Times, had gone off on a special mission for the Foreign Office through Burma, now Myanmar, China, and Siam, now China, pretending he had nothing to do with either the newspaper or the British government, but was simply a private individual. And when Lionel James, also of the Times, turned up to cover the naval side of the Russo-Japanese War in a chartered steamer fit up as a mobile radio station, the Japanese agreed to allow him to operate, providing he carried with him an intelligence officer of the Japanese Navy. In other words, in return for his permission to report naval engagements, the time ship also acted as a spy for the Japanese. Eventually, most of the correspondents packed up and returned home, defeated by censorship, until finally only Barzini and 2 news agency men remained. But while the agency men had to stay at Japanese headquarters, Barzini was free to roam the 40-mile front during the Battle of Mukden, a ghastly month-long battle of attrition won by the Japanese at a cost of 71,000 casualties, to the Russians 85,000. Barzini worked in terrible conditions, the cold often freezing the ink in his pen. But he sensed he was witnessing a major moment in history, and he filled 700 pages of notes, drew dozens of maps, took hundreds of photographs. The book he later wrote is still studied in Japanese staff schools. Militarily, Barzini was right. The war saw significant tactical changes resulting from increased firepower, the growth of artillery, and even the use, by Japanese, of a crude form of poison gas. Politically, the war had tremendous impact. Asia stirred from one end to another. An unknown and non-European race had scattered a European colonial power. The old-time glory and greatness of Asia seemed destined to return. Alone among the correspondents, Barzini understood the historical importance of what he had seen. The Russo-Japanese War marked the eclipse of the Golden Age. It had been a bloody period of history. Life had counted for little when measured against empire, glory, and mass circulations. If most correspondents had shown little perception of historical insight, at least their news reporting had been accurate. So one would like to believe that their graphic description of man's inhumanity to man, reaching as it did a larger audience than ever before, influenced public feeling against the war. But apart from McGahan's reports on Turkish atrocities in Bulgaria and Creelman's dispatch on the Japanese behavior in Port Arthur, there is no evidence that it did. On the contrary, it could be argued that the war correspondent in this period was only providing what the public wanted to read. Far from his arousing pacifist statement, the opposite could occur, as witness Hearst's whipping up of American sentiment in favor of the United States intervention in Cuba and his justification of American military atrocities in Philippines. To readers in London or New York, distant battles in strange places must have seemed unreal. In the Golden Age style of war reporting, where guns flash, cannons thunder, the struggle rages, the general is brave, the soldiers are gallant, and their bayonets make short work of the enemy, only add to the illusion that it was all a thrilling adventure story. Certainly, when their own country was involved, as Britain was in South Africa, the attitude of the war correspondent and his readers was remarkably different. Then, the first trials of an internal propaganda, which was to become such a powerful weapon in the First World War, and the patriotic hysteria that swept Britain, had a strong influence on war reporting. And that's the end of that chapter. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe. Share if you got friends that would like it too. Thanks.